Okay, many thanks for the introduction and kind words, Michael. It's a tremendous honor to be here today, and it has been a privilege beyond words to be part of DLP's story. So I'd like to put today's launch into a little bit of context, if you'll indulge me for 5 minutes. As Michael said, DLP was founded over a decade ago now by Adrian Leftwich, DLP's first director of research, and Steve Hogg at what was then AusAid. Many of you here will be familiar with Adrian and his long-standing work looking at the centrality of politics for development. And it's easy to forget now that his work at the time was groundbreaking, as Michael said, but also that it was marginal to key development debates for decades. Adrian's thinking on this really came together in what we call DLP-1, which is its first phase in partnership with the Australian government. Working with Steve and others in DFAT, and with talented researchers and practitioners from around the world, including people in this room today, DLP-1's work on politics, leadership, coalitions, and what we now call Thinking and Working Politically, or TWP, began to change the way many of us think about development. Sadly, Adrian passed away in 2013, and what we call DLP-2 began. As a team, we had the joy of building on DLP-1's hard work and success, consolidating some of the work shepherded under DLP-1 by Adrian and Steve, and bringing in new areas of research. And as Michael said, we've been part of a group of leading thinkers and practitioners working together as part of the TWP community of practice, where we're working collectively to try to bring a better understanding of how to turn insights from the sorts of research produced by DLP, from others like ODI, the Asia Foundation, Policy Practice, and so on, into actionable, practical ways to rethink development practice. And you're going to hear more about this work soon, but also throughout the next couple of days. When we decided that it was time to try to synthesize DLP's research and key findings, it made sense to do it over the full decade, rather than just the last 4 to 5 years that we've been responsible for. We wouldn't actually be able to truly learn from DLP's work unless we looked at the entire back catalog, as we call it. But that's the right decision, but it was definitely not an easy one. We needed to look at this 114 papers and lots of other outputs, half of which we weren't actually responsible for. And we needed to look at it with a fresh critical eye, to look at that transition from DLP-1 and DLP-2 and what that tells us about the history of the debates, to look for consistencies and inconsistencies as well over the years, and to try to think about what it all adds up to. And we needed it to guide DLP's thinking for a new phase of what we will probably call DLP-3 very originally. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work, but also one of the most challenging, was a growing awareness of how much DLP's earlier work has become central to many current discussions around development. And a lot of those are actually reflected in the agenda here today. And it's quite exciting thinking about 2 years ago, there was a panel on politics and TWP and development, and we were stuck in a small room where people were sitting on the floor, out in the hallway, and so on. So we've graduated to the big room now. We've seen work on coalitions, politics, thinking, working politically feed into the World Bank's World Development Report recently, something that for those of us who've been looking at how donors have looked at politics would have been unimaginable even when the TWP community started in 2013. Few people would now try to claim that you can do development without thinking seriously about politics. And yet, for us, looking back over DLP's early research reminded us that this used to be a controversial claim that required a degree of advocacy as well as evidence. The fact that the claim that politics is central to development has recently been described as a new orthodoxy is incredibly rewarding and probably a little bit bemusing to those of us who've been part of this long journey. For anyone here who has had the task of trying to synthesize the outputs from a large research program over time, you will probably understand the deep pain behind the smiles here today. We had a wonderful colleague, Cheryl Stonehouse, who's recently moved to leading communications for a UK nature charity, who painstakingly went through every single DLP output and coded, categorized, and produced reports for those of us to draw on. We had DLP's former program manager, Heather Lindevere, who organized us all, helped us focus, kept us smiling, and continued to influence us with her own work on developmental leadership, with her papers still being the #1 downloaded output from DLP. We had researchers, including several people here today, who wrote thematic reports that acted as the foundation for the overarching synthesis report that you'll hear about in a minute. We had a group of external challengers and peer reviewers in DFAT and beyond who provided rich, detailed, critical reflection and advice. Our senior research partner, Chris Roach, spent much time with us in the UK and on email and late night, early morning teleconferences at all hours, writing, guiding, and vitally, always making us come back to issues of gender and power. We had our comm team, Sarah and Ed, here in the room, who've been working pretty much night and day over the past few weeks, and with the designer, Stephen Dickey, to help make it all look very gorgeous and accessible. All in all, the report itself represents a year's worth of work for over 25 people. However, the really heavy lifting was done by David Hudson and Claire McLaughlin, who in the end needed to take all of this research over the last decade and pull it together in a way that guides their thinking for the way DLP3 will progress. They have my gratitude, my admiration, and I have to say, they have inspired me personally over the years, and I'm very, very thankful. So, with that in mind, it is a great pleasure to hand over to DLP's new director, Professor David Hudson, to talk us through the synthesis.
Gosh, thank you, Heather. Okay, so my role here is to present, if I can get the PowerPoints working. The report that covers the past 10 years of DLP's research, and as we can see, it's called Inside the Black Box of Political Will, which should become very apparent why it's called that over the next 15 to 20 minutes. And then after me, a couple of researchers, Tate and Nahir, are going to present ongoing work which directly comes out of some of these findings, and then Anna Nauper at the end will present a practitioner's perspective from the Pacific, which we're extremely grateful for. As Heather's already said, this is the work of many people, and it's invidious to suggest that it's any one person who should have their name on, and indeed it doesn't, for precisely that reason. The report comes in two flavors. There is the full report over 30-odd pages. There's also an 8-pager, because we're kind. And there's a focus on the implications. They're available on the website to download, and also there's a table outside with some hard copies, hopefully a few left still in there if you want to grab a copy. The main message that comes out of the report could be summarized very simply, and that is, how do we explain when, where, and how change happens? And all too often the shorthand that people use, and many people in this room will be familiar with this, is the answer of political will. But that's what we need. And the problem is often the absence of political will, when key decision makers, whether they be politicians or other leaders, aren't willing to expend valuable political and social capital on pushing reforms through. Which leads to the question, well, what is political will? How does it work? And how can we support or build precisely that process? So here's the argument in a nutshell. That first arrow that takes us up to the orange circle starts from this recognition, probably about a decade and a half ago, that politics was the crucial missing factor in explaining why reforms and institutional change fails to happen or fails to stick. And so often the interventions, the programming, or the initiatives that were behind social change were considered or were actually often politically infeasible. And they failed to try and either accommodate or overturn the vested interests that wanted to support the status quo. So what we think is that you have to back up a little bit and then try this alternative path. And you ask the question, well, what is political will and how do we build it? So if we unpack the logic of that argument slightly, it's a classic, what engineers and systems theorists call a black box problem. So we know that we have a set of inputs, and that's efforts towards reform, and something happens within this black box, and it matters whether or not you have the presence or absence of political will, and then you get successful outcomes or failure. The problem is, with a black box, it's opaque, and you cannot see the inside workings of it. And if you can't understand the inside workings of it, then it's very hard to try and support it, create it, etc. So that's what we're trying to do here. And then our answer is that one way of building political will, and it's very important to underline that, there are many ways of building political will, but one way is through the process of developmental leadership. And we define developmental leadership as a political process. It's a collective process, and one that involves contestation. And it's composed of three key elements. And these key elements kept on coming out of the empirical research that we reviewed over the past 10 years, time and time again. It's not a linear process. It's quite a messy process. But nevertheless, they are consistently there. So we say it's strategic. It's strategic because it's deliberate. People might not be able to push through the reforms they intended. They might not turn out how they wanted them to, but nevertheless, it is deliberate. And it's not individual leaders. And this goes to the point that Heather said about Heather Line-DeVere's paper, that it remains the most downloaded one, that looked at conceptions of leadership. And it found consistently that too often people conceived of leadership as an individual process or involving kind of heroic individuals, rather than this process of building collective will, whether that's through coalitions, whether that's social movements, interest groups, organizations. And it's a political process because it involves power. And it involves interests, but also ideas, and this notion of contestation, which for us is something that has always been there within DLP's work, but we've really been trying to pull out now. So contestation is the conflictual process of disagreeing, negotiating. It's not necessarily violent, and often it shouldn't be violent if it's political. But it's absolutely fundamentally necessary for the emergence of legitimate, locally appropriate, and therefore sustainable institutions. And I think this is really nice because it picks up a little bit on what Nancy Birdsall was starting to talk about in terms of the emergence of a middle class and the kind of the healthy disruption, as she put it, that ensues after that. So here are the three levels of developmental leadership. As we said, it's not a linear process, it's quite messy, there are lots of feedback loops, but analytically speaking, we can disaggregate it into individuals, and development and change cannot happen without individuals who are willing to mobilize and drive change. And whether it's pushing through legal reforms or whether it's agitating for women's rights, motivation isn't enough. It needs a combination of power, of opportunity, and skill as well. And this all happens within a context, an institutional context, that constrains but also enables. The second element, or level, is at the collective level. And here, most of DLP's research has focused on the role of coalitions. And we have lots of lessons about how coalitions are formed, about what drives them, about their strategies, because individual leaders can't bring around change single-handedly. And there's papers on coalitions in Fiji, in the Philippines, Tonga, etc., within our back catalogue, as Heather put it. And then we get to this third level, the societal level. And this is where the contestation really emerges, as coalitions engage within a battle of ideas. And it's this battle of ideas to reshape society's rules that are key. And the power and effectiveness of a coalition depends fundamentally on a coalition's ability to contest one set of ideas and then to help legitimize an alternative set of ideas to help build effective and sustainable institutions. So I'd just like to finish off by introducing a few examples from the DLP research papers from different case studies to illustrate these different points. So firstly, at the individual level, how do interests and ideas and values, how are they formed within an institutional context, and what about the opportunity for individuals to act around critical junctures or crises? So, motivation isn't something that is fixed. It's not a set of interests that are predictable. People have to arrive at their own understanding of what their interests are. And it comes from what sociologists call an internal conversation. So an interpretation of the environment, the opportunities, the values, and then a range of options are open to these individuals. So it isn't predictable, there's no mechanical logic here. And so crucially this matters because it means that motivations, values and interests are plastic. They can be changed, they can be molded, they can be shaped through people's experiences, but also through the interventions of external actors. So for example, Sarah Phillips's paper on Yemen looks at how the president had to weigh up what was in his self-interest, and it wasn't immediately apparent whether it's better served through pushing through developmental reforms or actually defending and maintaining the rent-seeking status quo. And another paper on the role of higher education within Ghana shows how education can create and shape these core values through the curriculum, both within the classroom and outside of the classroom, but also through creating networks that then leaders used to push through reforms later, and also disrupting traditional ethnic and kinship networks as they got pulled out of their home networks. As well as the paper on Ghana, there's also papers on the role of education within the Philippines, Somaliland, and Somalia, and also Mauritius as well. So also individuals have to be strategic. They have to maneuver within their environments. The environment doesn't dictate what happens. So for example, there's a great paper by Andrew Rosser and colleagues looking at the politics of free public services in Indonesia. And they look at 4 different districts and how the role of the district leaders and their heads was quite different across those districts and led to very different outcomes based on the political strategies that they pursued. So in a couple of them, they were all predatory leaderships. But in a couple of them, they decided to try and build a popular base amongst the poor. And what this did was this meant that free public services were provided because in the other districts, their focus was on consolidating patronage networks. So the lesson here is that there is room for maneuver for individuals within the institutional context they work in. So at the collective level, in the report, we look at how coalitions are formed, the role of interests around formation of coalitions, the role of values, role of pre-existing networks, and the role of inclusion and gender, as well as strategies. So we often assume that coalitions are formed around shared values, and often that's true, but it's not necessarily that straightforward, and I think Tate's going to speak to this point, that it requires a lot of political work to help maintain these values and maintain cohesiveness of coalitions. But also coalitions don't have to be value-based, not at all. John Seidel's paper on coalitions for change in the Philippines, looking at the syntax of 2012, is a really good example of this. The coalition that allowed the syntax to pass involved the president, but also British American Tobacco, also San Miguel Corporation, as well as doctors and health related organisations. So the crucial lesson here is that reforms are not made by reformists alone. And other papers detail different strategies that coalitions pursue. So for example, interest bundling, so trying to pull together different factions of coalitions around showing how their interests align. So for example, in a paper on the politics of climate change in China and India, showing how large Chinese companies had an interest in bringing in energy efficiency regulations because it would actually put the smaller companies out of business and help relieve them of the low-cost competition and increase their market share. So by bundling their interests together, it allowed the reforms to be pushed through. Also, framing is another strategy and lesson that keeps coming through. So for example, in Maris Tadros's paper on Jordan, this is obviously a context that has a very conservative ruling elite, very limited democracy and different cultural norms. And she details how the coalition had to frame the reforms around, in line with the principles of Sharia, but also the suffering of children and the elderly. So this family-friendly frame allowed the reform to push through, whereas maybe a focus on women's rights and other more kind of universal gender equality goals would have led to failure. And there's an interesting comparison there with what happened in Tonga, which I think will be spoken about in the panel this afternoon. Another key lesson that comes through is the role of pragmatism. So obviously pragmatism involves a lot of compromise, but it's more than that. It's more than the willingness to compromise. Coalitions can be, and often are, very exclusive. and they don't conform to the principles of good governance that many of us in the room, or indeed many development agencies, would push international norms, ideals of participation, transparency and equality, for example. But we have to be pragmatic, although there are normative questions that that brings up, which we should also address. So the final level here, the societal level. So coalitions' power and effectiveness fundamentally hinges on their ability to contest and delegitimize ideas that underpin institutions. So ideas are absolutely crucial in a lot of DLP's work. And in the report, there's a couple of examples that are discussed. For example, in Sri Lanka, the very entrenched and accepted and legitimate idea that free education is an intrinsic birthright fundamentally constrains the ability of any government or regime to try and push back on this without facing violent dissent. But we should also remember there are multiple grains within any society. So the role is often to navigate these different grains, these different ideas of what is and isn't legitimate, and to seize opportunities as well as to create them. So Kate McLean's paper on the miracle, on Medellin Miracle, was around how this city in Colombia went from being the most violent city on earth to become the most innovative city of the year a few years back, and about how elites started to perceive it was in their interests to stop losing out on the benefits of globalization, but also the competition that arose from new elites emerging to help address inequality and insecurity. But again, it fundamentally underlines another DLP theme, which is, yes, there is a critical juncture, there's a crisis, but people need to do political work within that crisis to help push change through. And I think this very nicely comes back to where DLP started with Adrian and Steve's paper around institutional indigenization, which essentially is the process of trying to create appropriate and legitimate institutions that are embedded deeply within local politics and culture. And so this process of indigenization relies fundamentally on the active participation and consent of local leaders, elites and coalitions. So that's how we conceptualize developmental leadership, and we finish, as I'm sure Blair XL would be pleased with, a set of implications for donors and other external actors. And we conclude that developmental leadership can, if carefully, be supported from the outside, and that change happens through jumps and critical junctures, but also very incrementally. And so there's an opportunity for strategic incrementalism by those of us who want to support the process. So aid agencies and others can encourage developmental leadership through supporting quality education at all levels, especially secondary and higher. External actors can and should work behind the scenes, often quietly, to try and create space. So not engineering reforms and outcomes, but creating the space for local leadership to emerge and work through their own politics. And to work with this kind of politics around legitimacy to help identify norms and ideas that may be open to contestation and open to political challenge without undermining the legitimacy of the actors, the coalitions that they work with. And all of this fundamentally relies on thinking and working politically. And again, these are detailed in more detail within the report. And I think the place to finish is that exactly that it's about trying to open up spaces for politics and contestation, not taking the politics out of aid to give an alternative view on what was expressed earlier. So don't intervene to determine outcomes, don't try and engineer the properties, but let the process of political contestation run its course. Thank you.
Thank you, David. A better summary of what DLP is about, I don't think would have been possible. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Nahir Dasandi to give us some insight on what this means in terms of a typical research program within DLP. So he will talk about contestation and consultation, the politics of Myanmar's investment law reform.
Great. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a piece of research that we're still doing. So it's ongoing research that I'm doing with David Hudson and Jasmine Burnley of Oxfam Myanmar. And the research, I mean, it feeds directly from some of these ideas that David has talked about, the last 10 years of DLP's work has considered. And hopefully it also kind of opens up some new areas that we'll be kind of focusing on going forward as well. So the project's about the investment law reform in Myanmar that's been taking place over the last few years. And at the heart of it is this issue of contestation. So one of the big benefits, or one of the big kind of pluses of the kind of move towards politics that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years has been much greater focus on contestation and bringing this into the process. So it's not about kind of designing ideal policies and just hoping that they'll then be implemented magically. It's really about thinking through how these things happen. And there's been lots of really interesting and lots of great work in that area. However, I'd say that a lot of the focus still very much tends to be on kind of, once you've got the reform, the issue of contestation is about pushback from various stakeholders within a society. So often we think of kind of elites with vested interests who are opposed to certain types of reforms. And so a lot of the thinking around politics is on how do we approach that level of contestation when there is that kind of pushback. And this, so the idea of contestation as part of the design phase of reform tends to be overlooked quite a lot. And so Merrily Grinder, who's done lots of great work on looking at kind of reform processes, one of the things she talks about in her book on education reform in Latin America is actually the successful reform cases where discussion of the reform was limited to a core team until the reform had actually been kind of nailed down. And it was only then that it started to be opened up. So there's certainly this argument that often we want to see a closed space for policymakers to design these reforms, design laws, policies. And so the view has tended to be that contestation is something of a problem to overcome, that we need to kind of think more about how we battle through with reform processes. And I'd argue that, or we'd argue that, you know, there's still a kind of very heavy focus on interest there, and the role of ideas is missing in part of that. And so the argument would be that actually good policies should come from contestation itself. There should be this kind of battle or struggle of different ideas to kind of design and then implement the best policy for that particular context. So some of the work around kind of PDIA, so Lamp Pritchett and Matt Andrews, again, talks about this kind of focus on greater engagement. There's a really interesting paper, particularly when we think about kind of technocratic organizations, which is what the focus will be on. So I'm going to talk about the World Bank's IFC. Often the kind of lack of contestation, the lack of challenge, leads to the persistence of certain ideas which in different contexts don't work out, which is what I'm going to go on to. I would say, as we've heard earlier today, so from Nancy Birdsall, I would say there's growing kind of recognition of the need for contestation, but often it's seen as, you know, once there's a developing middle class, this is where we start to see these issues. So there's a lot more skepticism of contestation and challenging ideas in a context like Myanmar a few years ago, which was kind of emerging from a long legacy of military rule. And so one of the things is looking at what's happened in Myanmar and looking at a series of kind of public consultations that's been going on in the country, which most people wouldn't have expected to be particularly, to inform policy in the way it has. So, the Myanmar investment law. So, a few years ago, so up until about 2014, there were two separate investment laws in the country. So you had a foreign investors law and you had a domestic investors law. And so for various reasons, particularly pushed from foreign investors, but also from a number of domestic actors, there was a drive to kind of to having a unified investment law for the country. So this started in 2014. I apologize for the very wordy slide, so it's just to get some of the details of the reform in there. So the IFC, so the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, led this process, supported by DFAT and DFID, and its role was to kind of advise and to produce this single new law. And what we saw was actually there was huge amounts of problems with the initial drafts of the laws that were produced. And so just to give you a very quick overview of some of the problems with the law that came out of the IFC, in collaboration with the Myanmar agency that deals with investment, so DICA, what we saw is a law that was, technically it was very flawed. So there were lots of issues over the wording, over the vagueness of the law itself, which were undoubtedly going to lead to problems. The whole emphasis of the law was very much on foreign investors, and there was almost no kind of regard for what was going on the ground in Myanmar at the time, and how this law would relate to some of those issues. It set up a new commission, which, again, because I'll speak quite briefly, but lots of issues over the incentives that were being provided to this new investment commission, which would have a huge amount of say on how investment proceeded in the country. So, over which areas would be liberalised, which companies would be granted access, all of those sorts of things. One of the biggest issues was around dispute settlement, and what the law tried to introduce in its initial drafts was a clause whereby an international company could take the government of Myanmar to court in any jurisdiction of its choice or in its home jurisdiction without going through any national processes. So this was unprecedented. It's still unprecedented in that you don't see this in a national law in any country. You might see specific contracts that have this kind of clause, but certainly not in a legal framework. And it potentially introduced huge amounts of problems for the government of Myanmar, partly because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the country had it was going through a huge transition, it still is, huge issues over land rights, so you had kind of multiple layers of land rights legislation, and as well as kind of traditional land ownership issues. You had contracts that were awarded by the military government, which effectively wouldn't be challenged, which were at the time being challenged in the country, but this law threatened. You had issues over compliance issues, particularly around the last clause in the contract, in the law, which said that the investment law would effectively prevail over any other law in the country. So you have a land rights law going through at the same time, and what you're saying is, if a company has signed a contract which says that they have access to this land, despite all of the other processes going on within the country, this is now going to take precedence over this. So a huge amount of problems with this law. And so through various processes, which I don't have time to go into, which in itself is quite interesting, civil society managed to force through, so both international and local civil society groups in the country managed to force through a series of public consultation processes. And this was fundamental in A, getting these issues really, getting these issues heard, and B, eventually kind of transforming this law into something which isn't perfect, and certainly there's still a lot of opposition to different aspects of it, but it's certainly far more improved than what we saw at the start of this process. So in terms of the limitations, some of the issues that the consultation process addressed very quickly. So one is the ideological bias of the organisation that was leading on this. So this was the IFC. So a couple of years ago in the World Bank's World Development Report, there was a whole chapter dedicated to kind of biases of development practitioners. And there was certainly, we could certainly see evidence of this with this kind of very standard, it was some would say kind of harking back to an earlier period of the types of economic reform that they wanted to see in the country. So very much about having this free market kind of radical investment context in Myanmar. A fundamental lack of understanding of the context. So again, in some of the interviews we've got, this term blank slate comes up quite a lot. The country was going through a transition. This was seen as an opportunity to really implement some, great economic policies. So issues over land rights were not discussed prior to producing the law in the first place. Issues around conflict barely mentioned, and obviously this is a huge issue in large parts of the country. The role of the military and what that meant for investment going forward. And then finally, it was the bias towards the other actors. So in a few of the interviews that we did, one of the things that people said was, we think the IFC was trying to be too political, which again kind of highlights this issue over how politics is thought of. And what they meant is effectively that They were trying to guess what the opposition would be. They had assumptions about the way the government of Myanmar would react, the lack of understanding from civil society, and so they were really trying to push through this law as quickly as possible. So we saw a series of consultations. I will talk a bit in the conclusion just about that. So the importance of the consultation process, to wrap up. So again, it's the biases that were really important here, that actually this opened up a process to really challenge, to inform those coming in about some of the issues faced. That's not to forget that there was a lack of expertise and capacity in Myanmar at the time. So there was a reason that the IFC was asked to lead on this. So this helped this kind of joint process occur. The other factor that made the consultation process so important was the speed of reforms taking place in the country. So what you had was this context of continual flux of laws and reforms, and so it meant there wasn't a lot of opposition. So we heard of when this law was finally passed, and it was under Aung San Suu Kyi's leadership, you know, the legislators were told not to debate it, just push it through. And again, in these kinds of contexts, we think, you know, the role of kind of consultation processes could be very important. So to finish, when the case is written up, hopefully it will bring about a kind of shift, not a shift, but certainly push forward this thinking around contestation and consultation and what it means, particularly in uncertain contexts and changing contexts, and what role it could play. One of the things that I didn't talk about, which was particularly important, is actually how, like the kind of technical details over the consultation process. Is it done in English or in Burma, and who gets to speak then? Issues around gender, all of these things played a really important role, and actually has gone into some of the thinking around consultation processes in the country. And I would say finally, there's a slight issue, I would say, of a tendency to go down this slightly crude kind of Machiavellian view of what thinking and working politically means. So I think it's important to recognise there's space for issues, normative issues, and not only space, but these are fundamental to any political process. So having contestation, looking at the trade-offs, are crucial to thinking and working politically. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nahir, and I'd invite now Tate Brinicum to talk to us about digital feminism in Fiji.
Excellent. Just bear with me for a minute. So I'm going to take us to a slightly kind of more micro-local focus. And I'm going to talk to you about a project that I've been working on in collaboration with 4 researchers at the University of the South Pacific. And this is a project looking at this idea of kind of online activism and digital activism, particularly how it plays out with a group of members of the young women's rights movement. So our participants in this research were 22 women from this young women's rights movement who had a history of engagement through their affiliation with NGOs like the Fiji Women's Rights Movement or FemLink Pacific, but also because of their status as Emerging Leaders Forum alumni, or ELFers. So the Emerging Leaders Forum is a year-long training program for those aged 18 to 35, and it consists of workshops and retreats aimed at developing young women's ability to critically analyse issues and further develop their advocacy skills. So much like we've heard from some of the other DLP research into the importance of higher education processes, these sorts of processes in Fiji have been incredibly important for forming a network of these alumni, these ELFers, who have these ongoing relationships and really kind of a bit of a social movement to advocate for concerns of young women throughout Fiji. So this project sought to understand how these people were engaging with digital technology, how they were using platforms like social media for activism and advocacy, and what, if any, were the kind of offline implications or actions from this. So why are we talking about social media in the first place? Well, Fiji's really been at the forefront of the Pacific's technological revolution and has some of the fastest growing rates of mobile phone uptake and social media use in the region, coupled with the lowest cost for accessing and using such technologies. And every time I put up this slide, someone inevitably asks, how can you have 133% mobile penetration? And that's because individuals have multiple SIM cards with multiple companies, which makes financial sense. So it's estimated that about 48% of Fiji's population are using the internet and accessing social media platforms. And this is from 2017, but it actually represents a 13% increase from the same time in 2016. So we're seeing that really rapid expansion in access and use. This increasing prevalence of social media in the country has had a profound impact on the kind of broader media and communications landscape. Those of you that are familiar with Fiji will know that the country's media landscape is one that's developed in accordance with the history of political instability. So even though we've seen the removal of kind of the public emergency regulations, the media industry still is heavily censored, often self-censored, out of the fear of hefty penalties associated with breaching the media decree. So there's kind of a lingering atmosphere of control and suspicion. As recently as this week, we've seen the arrest of the managing director and a journalist from Island Business in Fiji, based on a news story around a high-profile court case, industrial dispute. So something that's still very much playing out today. So in response to these restrictions on media freedom and taking into account these kind of technological advances, social media and online spaces have emerged as a really unique communication platform, a source of information, debate and dialogue, and really a platform or a tool for expressing political dissent, lobbying, and engaging in dialogue and advocacy. So returning to our research participants and how this plays out in their lives, digital technology and social media have enabled participants to access information and communicate in new ways and at an unprecedented scale. So as one participant noted, social media has enabled activists to gain exposure to a range of alternate narratives and perspectives on issues beyond the scope of their immediate social networks. So participants spoke a lot about having access to information around Black feminism, queer feminism, postmodernism, all these sorts of dialogues that were really important in shaping their identity as activists. But one participant also noted that social media really opened you up. So she reflected how we were all sitting in a room doing a focus group together, and we all knew each other, but that when you're out there on social media, you're exposed to a variety of comments and a variety of different points of view. Participants also noted how social media has the potential to transcend the physical space and into the cyberspace, removing geographical barriers to communication and participation, and enabling them to feel connected to kind of regional and global movements and moments in the women's rights struggle. For participants in this study, social media enabled the creation of virtual communities of solidarity and support. So scholars like Naila Kabir have talked about the importance of these kind of networks and spaces of solidarity and support in the women's movement. But for these participants, those spaces kind of took a more online form rather than a physical form. But these are also spaces for kind of contestation and accountability. And again, the idea of contestation plays out in this research in terms of internal contestation among people within the movement themselves. So digital technologies have fostered kind of a virtual community of accountability and transparency for activists, manifesting in two ways. So digital activists are able to first hold themselves to account and reflect on their changing perspectives by virtue of digital archives. So participants reflected a lot on the Facebook's On This Day function, where you're constantly reminded of images or comments that you made months or even years ago. So this notion of digital memory really allowed participants a space to reflect on their own growth and acknowledge instances where their continued education has resulted in a change of opinion or stance on a particular topic. Secondly, activists were also able to hold each other to account for seemingly kind of contradictory social media practices, providing a window into the views and perspectives of particular people that would not have been known were it not for these platforms. So one thing that regularly comes up in my research is this idea of slacktivism versus activism. So the common assertion that social media is kind of incapable of facilitating real activism and is really just fostering a generation of slacktivists or armchair activists, as depicted in the image here. However, research that has emerged in the last few years out of the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as kind of the Occupy movements and anti-neoliberal protests in the developed world, have demonstrated how activists can kind of successfully engage with the internet to facilitate this kind of offline protest. So for participants, social media activism was most useful for online campaigning, particularly when it comes to raising public consciousness, getting the attention of policymakers. Most participants noted a preference for using social media for disseminating statements press releases, policy documents, because of the inability to get these things published in the mainstream media. So a number of participants reflected on one campaign in particular, which was a 2012 ELF alumni campaign called Take Back the Streets. So this was an initiative in response to increasing instances of street harassment perpetrated by public service vehicle drivers in and around Suva. So activists created a Facebook group to document these instances of street harassment, a place where people could post the date, time, location, registration number, all of those sorts of things. Throughout this campaign, women's rights organisations like the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre, were invited to conduct a series of gender sensitisation trainings with the Fiji Taxi Authority as well as the Land Transport Authority. And the ELFA activists collated all the data from this Facebook group and presented it in a submission to the Land Transport Authority as part of consultations to amend the Code of Conduct and the Land Transport Act. So of particular interest in relation to this campaign is the notion that it challenges the assumption that online activism or engaging with social media is largely an exercise of preaching to the choir. So people often talk about how you're getting outside your own social network, your own immediate bubble on social media. However, as one participant noted in relation to this campaign, a lot of women who shared their stories were actually people that had come from far outside the women's rights movement. They wanted to talk to somebody who understood. A lot of people came who had never heard of feminism, never heard of women's rights. A lot of people wanted a place to vent their anger and frustration and a sympathetic audience. So this campaign was able to reach kind of far beyond the immediate ELFA network and engage with a much broader constituency beyond the women's movement. And these examples of online campaigning kind of show us two main avenues for influencing policy or bringing about change. So on the one hand, you've got this idea of kind of bottom-up digital activism. So that's the idea of generating digital momentum, mobilising public support, hosting public demonstrations and protests, and also for NGOs, for lobby groups to release these statements, to release press releases on a platform that's traditionally not available. But then you also see this idea of kind of top-down policy influence. So through the generation of kind of, if a story gets enough traction or gains enough buzz on social media, we've seen a trend that it's then covered by the international media, like Radio Australia or Pacific Beat, and this then necessitates Fiji's domestic media covering the story, as they can no longer ignore it if it's reached international heights. So we're seeing that while social media is being used in this bottom-up way, it's also being used to kind of circumvent the challenges of accessing the domestic media by working outside, getting international media attention, and then eventually generating enough momentum that it can no longer be ignored by the national media. I might finish there, but thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tate. I should just say as an aside, one of the great opportunities DLP has given this practice is the opportunity to access some of the younger up-and-coming academic minds really across the world, but certainly in Australia. And Tate, in my mind, is certainly one of those. I hate to think how influential you'll be in 10 years, but thank you again for another very fascinating presentation. Now I'd like to turn, save the best for last, to Anna Naupar. And we've asked Anna to give a practitioner's view of the politics of contestation, to try and take this work on research and theory to the practical level and see whether it works. Anna.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to the organisers as well for giving us the space to talk about this. I think I've been really lucky actually over the last 10 years that DLP's been around to really tap into the knowledge and think about how it plays out in the work that I've been able to do. And so normally I love to talk about Vanuatu, it's my favourite topic, and I thought this time I need to apply it to a different context. And so I've been working at the Pacific regional level for the last number of years, And so this was an opportunity to think about, well, what are the politics around contestation, power and ideas in a Pacific regional sense? And particularly to think about, well, how does that interact with thinking and working politically around development? So I'm going to sort of zoom us out a bit from the national level. And I apologise to those of you who know the region quite well, but just for those who don't, to think about the way we characterise Pacific regionalism is looking at the way in which countries interact with each other bilaterally, multilaterally, how they work together around common issues, and particularly how they also work together through a number of regional organisations. So these are intergovernmental organisations. So when we're talking about Pacific regionalism, there's a lot of parts to it, but ultimately they're all about the countries coming together to work around common shared issues, and often these are development issues. So there's been really good examples over the last number of decades around the Nuclear-Free Pacific movement and a number of other areas, which is why Pacific regionalism has been something that attracts many. And I think Australia has been a part of this. It's a part of the region, and it's been a big part of Pacific regionalism. And I think it was in the 2000s, many of you would have heard of the Pacific Plan that came out as the kind of a regional development plan that stated the common ambition for the region. And so this is what we'll be able to work together as countries and as our institutions, and we'll get behind this plan. Now, this all started to kind of shift when we came to the mid-2000s, to the late 2000s. And part of this was the political context in the region at the time. So we just had Tate talk about Fiji and what was going on there. There was the tensions in the relationships between Fiji and other countries, particularly Australia and New Zealand and Samoa. We were coming up to not too far off the 2015 mark, but it was coming up to 2010, and the MDGs were being required to be reported against. So it was a good time to sort of rethink, is the Pacific Plan doing what we want for the region? And so there was a review done in 2013 of the Pacific Plan, and it really said, the region's lost its way. We've been focusing on a technical document, but we've lost our way in terms of why we come together as a region. It said regionalism has to be more than the documents. It has to really be about the systems and incentives for why we work together and how we work together. And I think this is quite, when I first heard the DLP say, it's not a technical solution, it has to be a political solution. I mean, this was exactly the kind of thinking that was coming through, saying we need to shift what Pacific regionalism has been for the last 10 or so years and shift it back towards that political and system sort of approach. So the review, which was led by Sir Makere Marauta, former Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, he said, let's bring the politics back into this. Let's be much more conscious about politics in the region, in pursuit of our ambitions. And this was, said knowing that a lot of people are now describing it's a crowded and complex region. There's a lot of actors, both political as well as developmental. There's a lot more NGOs, which is great. There's a lot of philanthropics. There's a lot going on. Some also said, and I believe Professor Greg Fry here with USP, edited a book about it's time for a new Pacific diplomacy. So we need to find a new way. So how are we going to do this? So this was the shift that was needing to happen. So it was essentially looking for a paradigm shift and saying we need to move from a Pacific Plan that was very focused and had some good results, but still did not meet the full ambition for the region. And how did we shift it? So of course, there's another document called the Framework for Pacific Regionalism. But ultimately, this framework for Pacific regionalism was much more around saying the how. How are we going to do it? So rather than the what is it that are our common development ambitions, it was how are we going to actually organise and mobilise around that. And development is still a priority within this, but it's no longer the sole focus. And it really is about saying we need to tackle the political dimensions much more face on. And so one of the things that the Pacific Plan Review picked up, it said, well, we really need, if we want to be genuine about this, we have to overhaul the institutions and the financing, the processes, the systems, everything around regionalism if we're going to do this to where we need to take it. But as always, there's a process of contestation, and what that meant very different things for very many different people and countries. So for some countries, they said, oh, does that mean we're changing the regional architecture, which was traditionally centred around the Pacific Islands Forum? But because of the tensions with Fiji and its pathway back to democracy, there was some saying, well, no, actually, we just want to keep it small. We want to get away from, Australia and New Zealand. Others were saying, maybe we need to grow. Japan got very excited. And so that was one view. Another was, well, actually, is this an opportunity for those of us who fund regionalism? Is it an opportunity to rationalise our budgets and we tighten our belts and, make the regionalism project less costly? For the regional organisations that I referred to, and these are often called the Council of Regional Organisations in the Pacific, so the CROP, they thought, oh, we're going to lose our power because we're going to collapse into a single organisation rather than the many that we are with our unique points, niche areas. And lots of people said, look, we can't go back. We tried this in the 2000s, didn't work. Let's just, not rock the boat. So in short, even though we had that agreement that we were now on the framework for Pacific regionalism, how to really fulfill it and see it played out was not something that was agreed. So just to go quickly and reflecting on some of the points that have already been raised by David and colleagues, I want to focus on the building legitimacy for the reforms and gauging that political window for reform. And I double-checked, I did spell gauge correctly, but it does look funny up there. So this point about delegitimising the status quo and really before you can shift, you have to get agreement that you need to shift. And that was, the Pacific Plan Review really helped with that actually, because in the process of doing it, there was recognition that, okay, this isn't fulfilling our complete ambition for the region, let's start moving forward. It also helped that in the forum itself, it changed its own leadership, and that marked a chapter. So, but in delegitimising the status quo, it created a risk for the Pacific Islands Forum to actually remain relevant to whatever the new reforms would be. So that was a bit of the next sort of focus needed to be to re-legitimise the Pacific Islands Forum as spearheading the reforms. And you had to capitalise on political will for that and really use that opportunity of new leadership. Papua New Guinea was brought in as forum chair in 2015, and to really use that opportunity to say, okay, no, actually, we are going to remain in the driving seat. And we'll use this political window where we've got backing from countries to do that. But then to build the consensus around that, that was sort of where it got slower. I mean, I think that's what often happens in reform processes. So, where it gets slower is when you come back to thinking about your framing and your narrative. So what is the reform, what is it that we can settle on that will move us all together? And we had to think about, well, the framework for Pacific Region said we're going to be inclusive. So that became the framing. We're involving everyone. We're going to overhaul the processes for regional agenda setting. Also, it meant because of reframing, and you wanted to be inclusive, you had to have different approaches to coalition building. So you had your non-state actors, your countries, your crop agencies. There's all kinds of levels of coalition building. And then having the safe space to try things out. And there wasn't a safe space at that moment in time with all the other things going on. So the forum had to basically practice what it was hoping to reform and do it on itself as well. So it was reforming itself while also trying to reform the region. So that was another sort of layer. And in so doing, actually, it helped to build its legitimacy because then it was saying, we're trying it out, now can we broaden that into the wider reforms? But just to run quickly through the last few slides, I think when you're trying to shift from contestation to legitimacy, there are lots of layers, as I think lots of people have talked about. We worked with the countries and their various subgroupings around, can we get that political sort of settlement around where we need to go? We're to work with the technical agencies because they've been so used to, I hope this is off the record, they've been so used to kind of leading the way rather than being in the driving seat, and they were losing a little bit of that seat. And then through the process, we said, actually, it's a political process. We need to work with their governing councils because they're intergovernmental bodies. So actually, we're coming back full circle to bringing the countries in with the crop. So just to think about this, building legitimacy, it requires space, time, ongoing political analysis, all the good things of the DLP. But if you look at, the L is legitimacy. But if we look at the time it took, so the framework for Pacific regionalism was probably, it took the shortest time, which was why there was a lot of contestation as to then what do you do, which is why we're 4 years and counting in that. And then I just want to put in there that when we're thinking, we say political analysis, and let's do the analysis, let's really think and work politically, but that involves looking at the money as well, particularly for those in aid and development. And if we look at where the money, what funded what in this same process. So Australia was very generous in helping with the Pacific Plan Review. And then when it came to rolling out the framework for Pacific regionalism, and this was all part of the background, sort of how do you, the new leadership, the new chapter, Papua New Guinea coming in as the forum chair, said, no, we actually have to have some different currency in there to help broaden and de-emphasize that there's a particular influence in this reform process. So that came in. And then now in the rollout, and this is part of being tied up with the internal reforms for the forum as well as the broader reforms, now all the countries are actually paying for these reforms through a refinancing kind of arrangement within the forum. So that's really helped shift the perception of who's driving a reform and helps build the legitimacy of that it is a common reform. So I'll end on that note. You can read that cartoon. See, we were having a competition with cartoons, but I still think Tate won. But I just, I think just to close off there and to zoom back out, Australia's just come out with a white paper on foreign policy, and it really squarely puts the aid program and international development assistance smack bang in the middle of a political agenda. And so on one hand, this is really great for showing your cards and people understanding to a degree and anticipating to a degree how Australia might operate. But on the other hand, it then means for those of us who work in the development community, in the international development community, as an extension, yourselves are funded by Australian aid, and to understand the bigger picture when engaging, particularly in the Pacific regional space, as to what agendas and these perceptions about what agenda is being pursued, that those are real living parts of being in the Pacific. And so I think doing that ongoing political analysis, being comfortable with iterations and risk, in terms of trying it out, and then coming back to the drawing board are things that we have to keep doing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. Now we've got some time for question and answer. There'll be one roving microphone. Thank you, Robert. If I could ask people who'd like to ask a question to identify themselves and any affiliation, and address your question to the panel member you would like an answer from, or if it's to the whole panel, just make that clear. And I might take a clutch maybe of 3 questions to start us off if people have them. Thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name's Ali Bridges. I work for Office of Policy Management. My question, I think, it first came to me in the first presentation by Dave, and then it came to me again when Anna just finished off then. But it was, David, when you finished off saying that the process of political contestation run its course, but then we've just finished here with this understanding that the Australian aid program is now firmly within the foreign policy white paper, and that we do sometimes engage in issues, for example, I think of climate change, where there is definitely an aspect where we want to help build acceptance that is an issue that we then think needs to be changed. But often, we can't just dictate what we want, but we want to build that consensus where thereby engaging in these local political processes. I mean, how much do we feel comfortable about talking about that openly now if we open this black box? How much is it appropriate for us to engage in that level? And and how does it square with aid practitioners working with diplomats in DFAT to get everyone happy at the same time? So I guess this is for all of you to talk about, and I would love to know what the DLP's general view is on that, because it sounded like in the first presentation that you think that they should run their own course and that we should stand back. So yeah, just wanted to put that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another? Thank you, down here at the front.
Hi, Andrea Babin from La Trobe University, and my question was for Nahir. I was really interested to see if you could talk more about this idea of public consultations as a way to institutionalise contestation, and if there's some kind of rules of thumb around how those consultations need to happen to really foster that contestation.
Okay, one more. If we have one. Yes, just here. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Alexandra Barantes, and I'm part of Development Pathways, a consultancy firm based in the UK and Kenya. My question is a little bit in terms of the theoretical framework, I suppose, around the whole political will and some of the findings that you've been showcasing is, how does this relate in terms of the theoretical framework with a rights-based approach to development in general? Then we can go into specifics. And how does it relate to some of the practical issues around a rights-based approach in terms of social accountability, participation, and henceforth? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So we've got two questions, I think, to the whole panel. One to Nahir in particular. Maybe we'll start with that one. So on the question of public consultations as a way to institutionalise contestation.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So in the Myanmar context, it was certainly trial and error. So the first consultation process is looked on pretty negatively by those involved, and I mean it led to it wasn't a particularly nice process for those. It was quite an aggressive meeting by all accounts, but I think that helped kind of then because they did 2 or 3 or even a few more actually afterwards with the regulations. Each time, in credit particularly to DICA, so the Myanmar's Directorate of Investment, they took that on board and arranged translations to be there. So there was lots of stuff around local and international. I might just take this off because it's really annoying. I don't think it's my voice. So there was lots of stuff around kind of the international NGOs that were playing a big role in this consultation process versus locals. And so one of the ways that I think the IFC tried to So one of the things because I can hear myself breathing through it. So it's so one of the things that some of the IFC folk who weren't necessarily on board at the beginning, one of the things that they tried to use to delegitimize the whole process was to just say it was international NGOs that were interfering, and this is nothing to do with local actors. So. Which was also an interesting point, and one that got taken on board by all of the civil society groups involved. So I don't think there's a set framework, but I think it's one of those things that is going to depend on the context. But the nice thing is, in Myanmar, and I need to check up with Jasmine Burnley at Oxfam, they are trying to develop some of these protocols around what a consultation process should involve, who is included, how are they contacted, issues around language, around gender, all of those things. And the thing I didn't say, I guess, about the institutionalisation of contestation is, while I don't think people come away from the law thinking, oh, it's fantastic now, there is certainly a sense of at least our input is there. And I think the bigger impacts of helping strengthen local civil society, I think, is a kind of benefit of this. And also this feeling that there was a thorough process where we got to raise our voices about issues that we think need to be taken into account. And equally, there were a few occasions where the response we got showed us that maybe we were wrong on a few issues. So I think that kind of the legitimacy aspect that Anna was talking about, really important as well through that process.
Okay, thank you. So the question about how open can our conversations be now? You didn't really direct that to me, so it's a great relief. I mean, I would say as a public policy practitioner, they can be as open as we like. I don't think anything's off limits, but governments here and governments in our region will have their own policy frameworks and their priorities, but it is up to all of us to explain those, justify them, and where there is conflict, to try and reconcile that conflict in open discussion, not only between in the silent corridors of government, but with broader stakeholders, and that's part of the reason we participate in conferences like this. But would anyone else like to have a shot at that?
So I took the question about being around the standing back aspect. So one of the earlier papers by Sarah Phillips on Somalia and Somaliland, it painted a particularly bleak view about the role of aid agencies, donors, external actors in being able to create sustainable change, peace and security and stability, etc. And that's a real conundrum, because if that's the case, then everyone go home, kind of thing. But the idea that there's a DLP official view, I think, should probably be debunked. I think there's plenty of contestation amongst us as well, so that's good. But I think where we've arrived at is that there is certainly possible for nudging from the outside, and you look for the already present cracks within norms, essentially. And some of the recent work we've done around gender and politics and practice with Chris Roach and Helen Derbyshire, who's up there as well, that will be presented at 3 p.m, actually gives some good examples about this, about looking for people, organisations, coalitions that are already working in these ways. They already exist, they're already doing it. The mistake external actors often make is not to start from what's already happening. So I think that would be it. The other thing that takes us on to the final question from Alexandra about rights-based approach is being explicit about your normative perspective and where you're coming in. And I don't know, Nahir, whether you had anything to add on this, because I know you've done some work around rights and the kind of the trade-offs with taking a focus on political feasibility.
So, I mean, the rights-based approach, I haven't looked at that specifically and how it would relate to TWP, but I think one of the issues with the kind of political approach is, I think the work that informed it, a lot of the kind of early work going back to Adrian Lefwich's work and James Ferguson and those types of people kind of highlighted the trade-offs involved in terms of rights and economic growth and all of those things. And I think that's been lost along the way, where I think because it's been highlighted as a trade-off, there's a tendency to think, therefore, it's fine to overlook issues of rights. And I think that's I think, so from my personal perspective, it's a huge limitation of the TWP approach at the moment, is that there's not enough on at least acknowledging how and when we address these issues. If we're thinking about political change, do we wait until, so in the UK context, kind of Paul Kagame is a really obvious example of, someone that's done some very impressive things, a government that's done some very impressive things, but at what point does that become problematic in terms of that concentration of power? And so I think it's one of the issues that should be focused on going forward.
Okay, we might take another clutch of 3 questions. Gentleman at the back there. And next to him, and then one over here on my right.
Thanks very much. Is that on?
Yes, you're on.
My name is Josh. I work at Oxfam on disaster preparedness in the Pacific, and I'm just starting my PhD on politics and financing disasters. My question's around how you see these framings apply to the humanitarian context, where there's less time perhaps for contestation?
Hi, my name's Jane Pilkington. I also work with Oxfam. So my question is around the influence of thinking and working politically on donors. So DLP's been quite influential for many of us who are thinking about how change works, but I'm wondering how you see that influence working amongst donors, obviously in Australia, but also elsewhere, that is important for us in terms of engaging with these ideas and how we actually implement them practically, and also reflect them, for me, because I'm a monitoring and evaluation person, in our learning about what works and what doesn't work, and the things that we learn from adaptation and also failure.
Over here.
I'm John Cox from La Trobe University. I just wanted to disagree with Nahir about rights and thinking working politically, because to my eye, the DLP back catalogue has an incredible number of fantastic papers that show how you can vernacularize and create local support, especially around gender rights. So like the Tadros paper is just an absolute classic on a lot of those things. So I think it's all there, and it's a great archive to use. But anyway.
Fantastic. We'll get you to write a couple of endorsements shortly. Okay, so I take that as a comment unless Nahir wants to respond, but I might take the earlier two questions first. Maybe on the influence of thinking and working politically on donors, I might ask Heather to respond first on that. Heather Marquette, as the former director of the DLP, now working and worked very closely with us, obviously, but now working within DFID as well. She probably has a pretty solid perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the original meeting of the TWP Community of Practice, which was only the end of 2013, involved a number of really senior staff from various donor organisations, but they're under their own steam. And sometimes they're under their own steam without necessarily their senior leaders knowing about it as well. And so it was partly about where it came about from the start, was partly about how do we encourage and nurture change and openness to this agenda within funding organisations, and particularly donors. So that's where it started. And in a sense, it was a small group of people working towards communications and advocacy with a simple proposition, which is that politics matters and that we need to think and work politically, and how do we do that within these organisations as well. Within DFID now, and part of the thing that I'm able to see from the inside is actually how that works within the organisation. How do you get information in front of ministers? How do you sit down with colleagues outside the governance cadre in infrastructure, gender, education, and so on, and what kind of issues are they grappling with? What sorts of products, evidence products, programming advice, and so on is really useful. And, you know, we are able to draw on incredible expertise within the community from, you know, long-standing members like Graham, Bill Cole was here, and there's a number of people, but then also a rapidly growing base from civil society, implementing partners or so on who are trying to bring their expertise. All of that creates momentum. Having a social media platform helps, having people who are interested in it, and that starts to get ministers and senior leaders interested as well.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Anna?
Okay. Yes, I just want to pick up on that point too around influencing donors, and particularly because this morning there was mention of new donors and emerging donors within the Asian region, and in the Pacific at least, they're very political conversations already. That's their starting point, because it really is about a trade-off of you do this for me and I will give you some money for a bridge or something. So they already come from a very political starting point, but I think more importantly, as practitioners and thinking about aid and the donor-recipient relationship, I know we're meant to move on and talk about partners, but it's about also really looking at thinking and working politically with those who are the recipients, for lack of a better word, because when you do have an environment where these new, I mean, they're not so new anymore, but we call them the new donors, are still having quite political conversations, and you can't, at that moment, it's a backdoor deal sometimes, and the money lands in your government budget, and then you've got to do something with it. It's that point at which you need the thinking and working politically to make sure that it's used to the best way that it needs to be used for the country context. So I think there's also that element of who to look at.
Thanks, Anna. I might have to go with the question on framing in the humanitarian context. I'm a former humanitarian coordinator within AusAid, and I have to say that yes, sometimes consultation takes a long time. Sometimes fully inclusive consultation and contestation takes a long time, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I found thinking, working politically being extremely important in obtaining permission for humanitarian access for both our assets and organisations like Oxfam that we work with in partnership in response to humanitarian crises all over the world. So they may be kind of little slices of the larger political economy, and they might be little smaller slices of interests and incentives amongst those who wield power and influence and decision-making ability. But they're still important, and it's still important, in fact, sometimes even more important to think politically against that backdrop. Perfect example, our response to Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008, where gaining humanitarian access was extremely hard and extremely complex against the backdrop of that very, that devastating event which killed an estimated 260,000 citizens of that country. But we managed it, through some very creative, I think, very creative mechanisms and coalitions that hadn't ever operated in the international space and hadn't ever operated in Southeast Asia before. Lost me again. Here we are. There we are. And if we hadn't done that, and if we hadn't had other members of ASEAN putting pressure on the military regime in Myanmar behind the scenes, we wouldn't have got relief to the people who needed it. So I think it can sometimes be even more important in crisis situations. And as David mentioned in his presentation, never waste a good crisis. Crisis situations can be your window to sparking longer term and broader reform. And I think in that case, actually, Cyclone Nargis was. But just getting stuff to the people, the group of international actors who worked together on that had to think very politically and very creatively. I think we've probably got time just for one more question, if there's someone burning. Here, Nicola.
Perspective of program planning, design planning and implementation, that sort of really hands-on everyday work that we were doing at Post. And in part driven by the fact that during my time I was really struck by how hard it is to budge the primacy of technical solutions from the way we think about our programs and how we implement them. In part, there's a few other things that are really hard to budge. And to me, the work of the DLP, which I have enormous respect for, as similarly to the work of the broader DDD community, adaptive management and PDIA approaches and all these sorts of things, like many of these contemporary development discourses and approaches, they require us to make some fundamentally different starting points and ways of thinking about what we do. They're not just, do we do something a little bit different, or do we tweak something on a Monday morning at work? It's not quite that. It's actually quite fundamental. And quite often sits in contrast or in conflict with many of the dimensions and systems that we have in the programming cycle that we use. And I'd be really interested to whether you've got some reflections on where you've seen some of the differences in implementation approaches really take on board the implications of the work that you've done in a fundamental way, and how that may have changed then the work that people have been doing, the practitioners that you've worked with.
Okay, I think that's one for David. Chris might jump in too, given his proximity to the Australian experience.
Yep, okay. So thank you, Nicola.
No, I think yours
it's working. Yeah, I mean, and I think you're absolutely right to frame it in terms of it's a fundamentally different starting point, and it requires a different mindset, but also different systems to support that way of working. So there's a very practical element to that as well. And again, this is something that we pick up in the gender and politics research. But one thing is having a much looser sense of what you're trying to achieve right from the out, and let that emerge through the process. Another thing is that you're focused on bringing people together for that to emerge, rather than trying to engineer the solution, know what it is right from the beginning. Another one is the importance of, and this isn't something you can plan for, but having someone to provide political cover, which I'm sure a lot of people in the room will be more than aware of, that is key. You have to have those people that will act as the barrier between maybe the kind of centralised systems and reporting requirements, and being able to provide space for programme staff to be able to do to work in the ways that they want to work in. But then also there's the monitoring and evaluation issues as well, right? Both in terms of timelines, and I'm sure Chris will say something, and probably say something about overcoming premature evaluation or along those lines. But also collecting the right data as well, right? So if you're trying to build a coalition to do something, what are you trying to measure? The outcome, or actually the process of building a robust and effective coalition. So there are a number of things that do come out in the DLP papers, but I'm sure there's more. But Chris?
Well, all I say is come and listen to Helen Derbyshire at 3 o'clock this afternoon. She's looked at 14, through the gender and politics process research, we've looked at 14 case studies of programs that have done this, and tried to tease out how they, not just what they've done, but the kind of political economy of how they've been supported or not. And I think that's the issue. And I mean, I would like to see a kind of, we had a conference, DLP conference 2 years ago, which we called Positive Deviance. And I think the question is, where is this already happening, and how is it happening? Because I don't think it's happening in many places really well. So, but I think it is, and some of the practices ahead of the theory, and we need to be looking at that.
Okay, thank you all very much, and thank you for your interest from the audience. We're about to be kicked out of the room, so I do need to wrap it up. I'd like to thank again David, Nahir, Tate, and Anna for being on the panel, and others for chipping in. And please avail yourself of the synthesis report and read it.